Ars Notoria, Episode 5, Chapter 5, Operate Without Resistance. Why Force Creates Friction. Most people believe that power comes from force. If something does not move, they push harder. If resistance appears, they increase pressure. If the system does not respond, they escalate. This feels logical, because in simple environments, force works. Push an object, it moves. Apply pressure, something changes. But complex systems are not built like objects. They are built like networks of response. And inside these systems, force does not simply create movement. It creates friction. Friction is not just opposition. It is the system's way of protecting its structure. When pressure is applied too directly, the system recognizes disruption. And when disruption is detected, defensive mechanisms activate. These mechanisms are not always visible. They do not always look like resistance. Sometimes they appear as delay, sometimes as inefficiency, sometimes as subtle misalignment, sometimes as unexpected complications. But their function is the same: to absorb, redirect, or neutralize force. This is why many efforts fail even when they are strong. Because strength is being applied in a way that triggers the system's defenses. Instead of creating movement, it creates stabilization. The system tightens. It reinforces itself. It resists change more effectively. This creates a paradox. The more force is applied, the more resistance appears. The more resistance appears, the more force is used. And the cycle continues. Most people interpret this as a need for even more effort. But the problem is not lack of force. It is misalignment with structure. Systems do not resist all change. They resist threatening change. Change that disrupts their internal balance too abruptly. Change that bypasses their existing pathways. Change that forces reorganization without preparation. When this happens, the system reacts. Not consciously, but structurally. It increases friction, and friction slows everything down. Operators understand this differently. They do not see resistance as something to overcome. They see it as a signal that force is being applied in the wrong way, or at the wrong point, or at the wrong time. Instead of increasing pressure, they adjust position. They look for pathways where movement is already possible, where the system does not need to defend itself, where change can occur without triggering stabilization. This is the beginning of operating without resistance. It is not about avoiding effort. It is about avoiding unnecessary opposition. Because in structured systems, the most effective movement is not the one that pushes the hardest. It is the one that fits the structure so precisely that resistance does not activate. This is why some actions feel smooth. They move through the system without friction. They create change without struggle. They appear effortless, not because no effort is involved, but because the effort is aligned. Misaligned force creates friction. Aligned movement creates flow. And once you begin to see this clearly, power changes meaning. It is no longer measured by how much pressure you can apply, but by how little resistance you encounter while creating change. Resistance is information. Most people treat resistance as a problem, something to overcome, something to push through, something that stands in the way of progress. This interpretation creates a very specific behavior. When resistance appears, effort increases. More pressure, more speed, more intensity. But in structured systems, resistance is not random. It is information. It reveals where the system is stable, where it absorbs force, where it protects itself, where change is least efficient. When you push against resistance blindly, you are not solving the problem. You are confirming that you are acting at the wrong point. Because if the system allows movement, resistance is minimal. If the system blocks movement, resistance increases. This is not opposition, it is feedback, a signal about the structure. Operators read this signal differently. They do not ask, "How do I break through this?" They ask, "Why is this resisting?" This question changes everything, because it shifts attention from force to structure. Instead of pushing harder, they observe. Where exactly does resistance appear? Is it immediate or delayed? Does it increase with intensity? Does it redirect movement instead of stopping it? Each of these patterns reveals something. Immediate resistance indicates a rigid boundary. Delayed resistance suggests deeper structural limits. Redirection shows that pathways exist, just not in the direction currently taken. From this perspective, resistance becomes useful. It maps the system. It shows where effort is wasted. It shows where movement is possible. And most importantly, it shows where alignment is missing. This is why operators rarely fight resistance directly. They use it. They adjust position. They shift approach. They move along the edges of the structure instead of pushing against its center. This creates a different dynamic. Instead of increasing friction, they reduce it. Instead of forcing change, they allow it to emerge through pathways the system already supports. To an observer, this can look passive, as if nothing is being done. But the reality is more precise. The operator is not inactive. They are calibrating. They are finding where the system permits movement. And once that point is found, action becomes efficient. Minimal force, maximum effect. This is the inversion most people never make. Resistance is not there to be defeated. It is there to be understood. Because every system reveals its structure through the way it resists. And once that structure becomes visible, force becomes unnecessary. The path of least resistance is not weakness. There is a belief that runs deep in most people. If something is easy, it must be insignificant. If something flows, it must lack strength. If there is no resistance, then no real power is being applied. This belief is wrong, and in structured systems it is costly. Because it pushes people toward the exact behavior that creates friction. They choose difficulty to feel effective. They equate struggle with progress. They trust effort more than alignment. So they move against the system instead of through it. The result is predictable. More resistance, more energy loss, less actual movement. What they call strength is often just misplaced force. The path of least resistance is not the absence of power. It is the correct placement of power. In any system, there are regions where movement is difficult. Dense zones, rigid structures, high stability areas. These regions are designed to resist change. Not because change is impossible, but because change there requires disproportionate energy. Most people push directly into these zones. They try to break them. Sometimes they succeed, but the cost is high. Time, energy, opportunity. And often, by the time they force change, the system has already adapted around them. Operators move differently. They do not ask, where is resistance lowest so I can avoid effort? They ask, where does movement naturally propagate? This is a different question. It does not look for comfort. It looks for amplification. Because the path of least resistance is not about ease. It is about efficiency of transmission. When movement aligns with the structure, it travels further, faster, with less loss. The system carries it, instead of absorbing it. This is why certain actions create large outcomes with minimal visible effort. Not because they are weak, but because they are placed where the system already supports movement. Think of flow, not force. Force pushes against structure. Flow moves within it. Force requires continuous input. Flow sustains itself once aligned. This is the difference. And it is not intuitive, because it removes the emotional validation of struggle. There is no visible effort, no resistance to overcome, no dramatic confrontation, just movement. Clean, quiet, effective. This can feel uncomfortable, because it contradicts everything people associate with power. But in complex systems, the strongest position is not where resistance is highest. It is where resistance does not need to activate at all. This is where leverage becomes invisible, because the system does most of the work. And once you understand this, a shift happens. You stop asking, "How do I push harder?" And you start asking, "Where does movement already want to go?" That question is the beginning of operating without resistance. Redirection beats confrontation. Confrontation feels decisive. You see a barrier, you move toward it. You try to break it. This creates a sense of control. You are acting directly on the problem. But in structured systems, confrontation is rarely the most effective move. Because confrontation does not just apply force, it activates defense. When you push directly against a structure, the system responds by stabilizing itself. It reinforces the exact point you are trying to change. Boundaries harden, pathways close, resistance increases. The system does not remain passive, it adapts. And the more direct the confrontation, the stronger the adaptation. This is why many efforts escalate without producing results. Each attempt to force change strengthens the structure you are pushing against. Not because the system is stronger than you, but because you are interacting with it in the most predictable way. Predictable actions are easy for systems to resist. Redirection changes this dynamic completely. Instead of attacking the barrier, you shift movement away from it. You do not try to break the system, you bypass it. At first, this can feel indirect, even counterintuitive, because you are not engaging the problem where it is most visible. You are moving around it. But this is precisely what makes it effective. Systems are optimized to defend their central structures. They are less prepared for movement along their edges, peripheral pathways, indirect routes, unpressured zones. These areas often allow movement with far less resistance, not because they are weak, but because they are not the primary points of stabilization. Operators look for these pathways. They observe where the system is rigid and where it is flexible. They do not waste energy on rigid zones. They move through flexible ones. This creates a different kind of leverage. Instead of forcing change at the point of resistance, they alter the system from a position where resistance is minimal. And once enough movement accumulates through these alternative pathways, the structure begins to shift. Not through confrontation, but through reconfiguration. The system adapts to the new flow. The original barrier loses relevance, not because it was destroyed, but because it was bypassed. This is a critical distinction. Breaking a structure requires continuous force. Bypassing a structure makes it unnecessary. This is why redirection is more efficient. It does not trigger defense in the same way. It does not create escalation. It changes the context in which the system operates. From the outside, this can look subtle, even passive. There is no visible clash, no obvious struggle, just a gradual shift. But that shift is structural, because it changes where movement occurs. And once movement changes location, influence follows. Over time, the center of the system can move. What was once central becomes peripheral. What was once blocked becomes irrelevant, all without direct confrontation. This is why operators rarely engage systems head-on, not because they avoid conflict, but because they understand where conflict is inefficient. They recognize that the shortest path is not always the most direct one. Sometimes the fastest way forward is the one that avoids resistance entirely. And once you begin to operate this way, a pattern becomes clear. Systems are not overcome by force. They are reshaped by movement. And movement, when aligned correctly, does not need to fight. System compliance. Not all movement inside a system is resisted. Some actions pass through almost unnoticed. Some changes integrate quickly. Some shifts are not only accepted, they are facilitated. This is not random. Systems do not allow movement equally. They selectively permit it. This is what creates system compliance. A system complies with actions that do not threaten its core structure, and it resists actions that destabilize it too quickly. Most people ignore this distinction. They assume, if something is possible, it should work anywhere. So they apply the same approach across different conditions. And when resistance appears, they increase effort. But the issue is not effort. It is that the action does not fit the system's acceptance conditions. Every system has implicit rules, not written, not obvious, but structurally enforced. These rules define what kind of change is tolerated, what kind of movement is amplified, what kind of behavior is neutralized. When an action aligns with these rules, the system does not resist it. It carries it. It integrates it. Sometimes it even accelerates it. This creates the illusion of ease, as if things are simply working. But what is really happening is compliance. The system is allowing the movement, because the movement fits within its structural limits. Operators do not ignore this. They study it. They ask, what does this system naturally support? What patterns already exist here? What kind of change can occur without triggering defense? This is where strategy becomes precise. Instead of forcing something new into the system, they embed movement within what the system already accepts. They do not introduce disruption directly. They encode change inside familiarity. This reduces friction, because the system does not recognize the movement as a threat. It recognizes it as continuation. This is subtle, but powerful, because once movement is accepted, it can expand, gradually, without resistance, until the structure shifts. And by the time the shift becomes visible, it is already integrated. This is how systems are changed without confrontation, not by breaking rules, but by operating within the boundary of what is allowed, while slowly redefining that boundary. This also explains why some actions fail immediately. They violate core structural constraints. They trigger defensive responses instantly. The system recognizes them as incompatible and blocks them. No amount of force changes this, because the issue is not intensity. It is misalignment with compliance conditions. On the other hand, actions that succeed often appear simple, unremarkable, even obvious. But their power lies in the fact that they are structurally permitted. They move where movement is already possible. This creates a compounding effect. Small allowed movements accumulate. They reinforce themselves. They expand into larger shifts, and eventually, they alter the system from within, without ever triggering full resistance. This is why operators rarely begin with disruption. They begin with compliance. They enter the system through what it accepts. They move along permitted pathways. And only once they are inside the flow do they begin to reshape it. From the outside, this looks effortless, but it is not. It is precise alignment with structure. Because in complex systems, the most effective change is not the one that is forced. It is the one that is allowed to happen until it becomes irreversible. Soft entry, hard outcome. Direct entry creates attention. Attention creates evaluation. Evaluation creates resistance. This sequence is automatic. When a system detects something new entering with force, it immediately assesses it. Is this compatible? Is this disruptive? Does this require containment? And in most cases, the answer is defensive. Not because the system is hostile, but because preservation is its default state. This is why hard entry fails. It signals disruption too early. The system reacts before the movement has a chance to integrate. Soft entry works differently. It does not announce itself. It does not present as force. It enters as something that already belongs. Familiar patterns, recognizable structures, acceptable variations. From the system's perspective, nothing significant is happening. There is no reason to resist, no signal of threat, so the movement is allowed to pass. At this stage, the change is small, almost invisible. It does not alter the system immediately. It integrates into it. This is the first phase, entry without resistance. Most people underestimate this phase because it does not produce immediate results. It feels slow, unimpactful. But this is where positioning occurs. The movement is no longer outside the system. It is inside. And once inside, the rules change. Now the movement can expand, not by force, but by replication. Small aligned elements begin to spread. They connect with existing structures. They reinforce each other. And gradually they increase presence within the system. At this point, the system still does not resist, because the change is distributed, not concentrated. It does not appear as a single disruptive force. It appears as a natural variation, something the system can absorb. This is the second phase, expansion without detection. But expansion leads to accumulation, and accumulation leads to influence. At a certain point, the distributed movement reaches a threshold. It is no longer small. It is no longer isolated. It becomes a structural factor. Now the system must adapt. But it is too late to resist directly, because the movement is already integrated. It is part of the system. Removing it would require disrupting the system itself. So instead of rejecting it, the system reorganizes around it. This is the third phase, transformation without confrontation. The outcome is significant, sometimes massive, but the process that created it was quiet, gradual, aligned. This is the meaning of soft entry, hard outcome. The entry is minimal. The result is structural. Most people try to reverse this. They attempt strong entry to produce fast results. But strong entry triggers resistance, and resistance blocks integration. So the outcome remains limited. Operators invert this logic. They reduce intensity at the beginning. They prioritize entry over impact. Because once entry is secured, impact can grow from within. This requires patience, but not passive patience, strategic patience. Waiting is not the goal. Positioning is. And once positioning is achieved, growth becomes inevitable. Not immediate, but irreversible. From the outside, this often looks like sudden success, as if something appeared out of nowhere. But it did not. It entered quietly, expanded silently, and only became visible when it could no longer be removed. This is how systems are reshaped without resistance, not by forcing change from the outside, but by becoming part of the system before changing it. Delay as a weapon. Most people associate action with control. If something needs to change, they act. If movement is required, they initiate it. If opportunity appears, they respond immediately. This creates a constant pattern of reaction. Action becomes automatic. Speed becomes a substitute for clarity. But in structured systems, immediate action is not always an advantage. Sometimes, it is the fastest way to lose position. Because acting too early exposes intent. And once intent is visible, the system adjusts. It recalibrates. It prepares. It begins to resist. What could have moved quietly now becomes contested. This is where delay becomes strategic. Not as hesitation, not as indecision, but as controlled non-action. Delay allows the system to continue forming without interference. It allows pressure to accumulate. It allows structures to become clearer. And most importantly, it allows others to act prematurely. This is critical, because early actors often reveal the system. They test boundaries. They trigger responses. They expose where resistance exists. And in doing so, they provide information. Information that would otherwise require effort to uncover. Operators do not ignore this. They use it. They observe how the system reacts to others, where it blocks movement, where it redirects it, where it allows it. This creates a map, not theoretical but real, based on actual interaction. While others are spending energy, the operator is gaining clarity. This is the first advantage of delay. The second is positioning. As time passes, systems move closer to thresholds. They accumulate tension. They reduce possible outcomes. They become more defined. Acting before this process is complete is inefficient, because the system is still flexible, still undecided, still capable of shifting in multiple directions. But once enough structure has formed, the system narrows. And this is where delay turns into precision. The operator enters at the moment where movement is no longer uncertain, but not yet visible. This is the optimal point. Too early, and the system is unclear. Too late, and the opportunity is gone. Delay allows alignment with this moment. It creates timing advantage without force. There is also a third effect. Delay reduces friction. When action is immediate, it creates attention. Attention creates evaluation. Evaluation creates resistance. But when action occurs after the system has already begun shifting, it feels natural, expected, even necessary. The system does not resist what it already recognizes as part of its direction. So the same action that would have been blocked earlier is now accepted. Not because it changed, but because the system changed. This is why delay is misunderstood. It looks like inaction, like passivity, like hesitation. But in reality, it is controlled timing. The difference is subtle, but decisive. Because in structured environments, power is not only about what you do, it is about when you choose not to act. And once you begin to see this clearly, action becomes selective. You no longer respond to every signal. You wait for alignment. You wait for structure. You wait for the moment where movement does not create resistance, but follows inevitability. This is when action becomes efficient. Minimal input, maximum effect. And everything that happened before that moment was not wasted time. It was preparation. Operating without visibility. Visibility feels like power. Being seen, being recognized, being acknowledged as the source of movement. Most people are drawn to this. They want their actions to be noticed. They want their influence to be visible. They want confirmation that they are the cause of change. But in structured systems, visibility has a cost. The moment an action becomes visible, it becomes traceable. Once it is traceable, it becomes interpretable. And once it is interpretable, it becomes resistible. The system does not need to fully understand what is happening. It only needs to detect that something is happening. That detection is enough, because detection activates response. Evaluation begins. Patterns are analyzed. Counter-movements form. Even if the system reacts slowly, it begins adapting, and adaptation reduces leverage. This is why visibility is not neutral. It shifts the environment. It turns movement into a target. Operators understand this. They do not seek invisibility as an aesthetic. They use it as a structural advantage. Operating without visibility does not mean doing nothing. It means moving in ways that do not trigger detection early. Movement remains distributed. Influence remains indirect. Change remains embedded. Instead of creating a clear signal, it creates diffusion. No single point carries enough intensity to attract attention. No single action appears decisive. The system cannot isolate the source, so it does not respond effectively. This creates a window, a phase where movement accumulates without resistance, because resistance has nothing clear to attach to. Most systems are designed to react to concentrated signals, clear disruptions, identifiable sources, defined changes. Diffuse movement bypasses this. It spreads across multiple pathways. It integrates into existing patterns. It appears as variation rather than disruption. This is why it is effective, because the system does not recognize it as something that requires immediate correction. But diffusion is not randomness. It is controlled distribution. Operators do not scatter action without direction. They place it across the structure in a way that builds coherence over time. Small shifts in multiple locations, aligned in direction, separated in visibility, individually insignificant, collectively decisive. This creates a delayed convergence. At first, nothing appears connected. The system continues as usual. Then gradually, patterns begin to align. Flows begin to shift. Structures begin to reorganize. And by the time this becomes visible, The movement is already integrated. It cannot be isolated. It cannot be removed without affecting the entire system. This is when visibility appears. But at this point, visibility no longer reduces leverage. Because the system has already adapted. The change is already embedded. This is the key. Visibility after integration is harmless. Visibility before integration is costly. Most people reverse this. They act visibly at the beginning. They announce change before it is supported. They concentrate movement too early. And in doing so, they trigger resistance at the exact moment when the system is easiest to defend itself. Operators delay visibility. They allow movement to develop in low detection conditions. They avoid creating a single identifiable source. They let the system carry the change before exposing it. This creates a different dynamic. Instead of confronting resistance, they bypass it. Instead of triggering defense, they avoid it. Instead of forcing recognition, they delay it. From the outside, this can look subtle, even unintentional. There is no clear moment where change begins, no obvious source, no visible driver. But the outcome is real, and often irreversible. Because the system has already reorganized itself around the new structure. This is why operating without visibility is powerful. Not because it hides action, but because it protects formation. It allows change to exist before it is recognized. And once change exists structurally, recognition no longer matters. Controlled exposure. Visibility is not a state. It is a variable inside the system. Most people misunderstand this completely. They think visibility is about being seen. They think exposure creates influence. They think recognition equals power. So they push toward it too early. They reveal before they are ready. And in doing so, they trigger the exact mechanism that limits them. Because the moment something becomes visible, it becomes addressable. It can be analyzed. It can be categorized. It can be resisted. The system does not need to fully understand it. It only needs to recognize that something is forming. That is enough to activate response. This is why early exposure is structurally dangerous. Not because visibility is bad, but because structure is incomplete. At the beginning, movement is fragile. It is not yet distributed, not yet embedded, not yet connected across the system. So when it becomes visible, it is easy to isolate, easy to contain, easy to remove. The system reacts with precision, and the movement collapses before it has time to integrate. This is where most attempts fail, not because the idea is weak, but because it was revealed before it became structurally irreversible. Operators do not make this mistake. They do not treat visibility as a goal. They treat it as a stage in a sequence. At the lowest level, movement exists without identity. It is present, but not recognized as a pattern. Signals are weak, distributed, disconnected in appearance. At this stage, the system does not react, because there is no clear target. This is the formation phase. Here, the structure builds silently. Connections form. Alignment develops. Nothing appears significant, but internally, coherence is increasing. The second level introduces controlled exposure. Now fragments begin to appear. Small signals become noticeable. Patterns start to hint at something larger. But they remain incomplete, ambiguous, difficult to define. This ambiguity is critical, because systems do not respond effectively to what they cannot clearly interpret. They hesitate, they observe, they delay reaction. And during this delay, expansion continues. The structure grows beneath partial visibility. This is the most delicate phase. Too much exposure here, and the system locks onto the pattern. Too little, and growth remains slow. So exposure must be calibrated, gradual, layered, always slightly behind full recognition. Operators maintain this imbalance intentionally. They allow the system to sense movement, but not fully understand it. This keeps resistance low, while still increasing spread. Eventually, the structure reaches a point where it is no longer isolated. It is embedded. connected across multiple pathways, interdependent with existing elements. At this point, removal becomes costly, because removing the movement would require disrupting the system itself. Now the third level becomes possible: full exposure. The pattern becomes clear, recognizable, defined. The system sees it, names it, acknowledges it. But now something has changed. Visibility no longer weakens the movement. It strengthens it, because recognition now amplifies what already exists. It attracts alignment. It accelerates adoption. It reinforces structure. The same visibility that would have destroyed the movement earlier now makes it dominant. Not because visibility changed, but because the structure reached irreversibility. This is the core principle. Exposure should not reveal what is forming. It should reveal what can no longer be undone. Most people reverse this. They expose early, then try to stabilize under pressure. Operators stabilize first, then expose. This creates a completely different dynamic, because the system is never given the opportunity to reject the movement at its weakest stage. It is only presented with the movement when rejection is no longer efficient. This is why controlled exposure feels like timing from the outside, as if someone knew the right moment. But it is not timing, it is sequencing. Visibility is not a switch, it is a progression. And once that progression is understood, exposure stops being a risk. It becomes a tool, one that determines whether the system resists or carries the change forward. Integration without reaction. There is a stage where movement no longer needs to fight, not because resistance disappears, but because resistance never activates. This is the difference between forcing change and becoming part of the system before changing it. Most people try to impose outcomes. They introduce something new. They push it into the structure. They expect the system to adapt around it. But systems do not adapt easily to external pressure. They evaluate it. They test it. They decide whether to accept or reject it. And in most cases, rejection comes first. Because external force signals disruption. It signals imbalance. It signals something that must be controlled. Integration works differently. It does not present itself as external. It does not arrive as a force that needs to be evaluated. It enters as something that already belongs. At first, it does not attempt to change the system. It aligns with it. It follows existing pathways. It mirrors accepted patterns. From the system's perspective, nothing unusual is happening. There is no need to react, no need to defend, no need to stabilize. This is the first condition: no reaction. And without reaction, movement continues, quietly, smoothly, without interruption. This creates a structural advantage, because change is occurring in an environment that is not resisting it. But integration is not imitation. This is where many misunderstand. Imitation copies the system. Integration embeds within it. The difference is subtle, but decisive. Imitation stays on the surface. It repeats visible patterns without altering structure. Integration moves deeper. It connects to internal pathways. It becomes part of the system's operation. Once embedded, movement begins to expand, not by force, but by propagation through existing structure. The system carries it, because it is no longer external. It is internal. At this stage, reaction is still minimal, because the system does not distinguish the movement from itself. It recognizes it as part of its own flow. This allows accumulation, and accumulation creates influence. As the integrated elements grow, they begin to interact. They reinforce each other. They align across different parts of the system, and gradually, they shift how the system functions. Not abruptly, not visibly, but structurally. This is the second condition: change without detection. The system is already different, but it has not recognized that difference yet. By the time recognition occurs, integration has reached depth. The movement is no longer isolated. It is connected, interdependent. Removing it would create instability. So instead of resisting, the system adapts. It reorganizes around what has already been integrated. This is the third condition: acceptance after transformation. From the outside, this looks smooth, as if the system simply evolved, as if change occurred naturally, without pressure, without conflict. But the process was precise. It was staged: entry without reaction, expansion without detection, transformation before recognition. This sequence removes the need for confrontation, because confrontation only becomes necessary when integration fails, when something remains external, when something is forced before it is embedded. Operators avoid this entirely. They do not push against the system. They move inside it. They do not demand change. They allow change to become unavoidable. This is why their actions appear effortless, because effort is not spent overcoming resistance. It is spent aligning with structure. And once alignment is achieved, movement no longer needs to fight. It continues, carried by the system itself. At this level, control looks different. There is no visible force, no obvious pressure, no direct confrontation. Only movement that fits so precisely that the system has no reason to stop it. And when movement reaches that state, it becomes difficult to trace, difficult to oppose, difficult to reverse. Because it is no longer something acting on the system. It is something the system has already become. Silent dominance. There is a point where influence no longer needs to prove itself. No signals, no declarations, no visible assertion of control. Yet the outcome is clear. Movement follows a direction that cannot easily be explained. Decisions align without coordination. The system behaves as if guided, but without an identifiable source. This is silent dominance. It is not absence of power. It is power that no longer requires visibility to function. Most people associate dominance with presence. They expect it to be seen, to be asserted, to be recognized by others. This expectation creates a very specific pattern. They concentrate influence into visible actions. They create signals. They attach identity to movement. And in doing so, they make that movement traceable. Traceability creates vulnerability. Because once a source is identifiable, it becomes a point of resistance. The system can respond directly. It can isolate. It can counter. Silent dominance removes that point. There is no single source, no central signal, no obvious origin. Instead, influence is distributed across the structure. It exists within pathways, not above them. It operates through alignment, not through assertion. This is why it is difficult to detect. The system does not see something acting on it. It experiences itself changing. This distinction is critical, because systems resist external control, but they do not resist what appears to be internal development. Operators reach this state gradually, not by hiding influence, but by dissolving its visibility as a separate force. At first, movement is intentional, directed, placed within the system. Then it becomes integrated, connected across multiple points, and eventually, it becomes ambient, part of the system's normal operation. At this stage, influence no longer needs to act directly. It shapes how the system behaves by default. This creates stability, because there is nothing to oppose, no clear action to counter, no event to react to, only a structure that produces consistent outcomes. From the outside, this looks like inevitability, as if the system has a natural direction. But that direction was not accidental. It was built, quietly, incrementally, through alignment rather than force. Silent dominance is the final extension of operating without resistance, because resistance depends on detection, and detection depends on visibility. When influence is no longer visible as a separate entity, Resistance has nothing to attach to. This does not mean the system is passive. It continues to adapt, to evolve, to respond to internal and external inputs. But the underlying direction remains stable, because it is embedded within the structure itself. This is why silent dominance does not need to be maintained through constant action. It sustains itself. The system carries it, reinforces it, reproduces it through its own processes. This is the highest form of leverage, not control through force, not influence through visibility, but direction without friction. Most people never reach this level, because they remain attached to recognition. They want to see their influence, to confirm it, to claim it. And in doing so, they bring it back into visibility, which brings it back into resistance. Operators let go of this. They do not need to be seen as the source, because the outcome is already aligned. The system is already moving. And once movement becomes self-sustaining, identity becomes irrelevant. This is the paradox. The less visible the source, the more stable the influence. Because stability does not come from control. It comes from integration so complete that control is no longer required. At that point, the system is not being directed from the outside. It is operating from within a structure that has already defined its path. And nothing needs to be said, because everything is already moving. The final inversion. At the beginning, power looks like force. You push, you act, you try to move the system directly. And when resistance appears, it feels natural to increase effort. This is the default model. Force creates movement. More force creates more movement. But everything in this chapter has been pointing toward a different structure, one that does not behave like this. Because in complex systems, force does not scale cleanly. It creates friction. It triggers response. It activates defense. And over time, it reduces its own effectiveness. This leads to the inversion. Not a small adjustment, a complete reversal of how power is understood. Power is not the ability to apply force. It is the ability to move without triggering resistance. This changes everything, because it removes force as the primary tool and replaces it with positioning, timing, and alignment. Instead of asking, "How do I make this happen?" the question becomes, "How does this system already allow movement?" This shift is subtle, but it separates two completely different modes of operation: the reactive mode and the structural mode. In reactive mode, action follows visibility. Something happens. You respond. You adjust. You try to influence what is already in motion. In structural mode, action precedes visibility. You read formation. You recognize constraint. You align before outcomes appear. This is the first layer of the inversion. The second layer is more difficult. It removes the need for confrontation. Most people believe change requires conflict, that something must be broken, overcome, defeated. But in structured systems, confrontation is often inefficient, because it strengthens what it opposes. It activates defense mechanisms. It creates attention at the wrong moment, and attention brings resistance. So instead of breaking the system, the operator moves within it, through it, along pathways where resistance does not activate. This is not avoidance. It is precision. Because when movement aligns with structure, the system carries it forward, without friction, without interruption. The third layer removes visibility as a requirement. This is where most people hesitate, because visibility feels like confirmation, proof that something is working. But visibility also creates exposure, and exposure creates response. So the operator delays it, not completely, but strategically. Movement is allowed to form before it is revealed. Integration occurs before recognition. By the time visibility appears, the structure has already shifted. This is why the outcome feels sudden, but the process was gradual, hidden, layered. The final layer is the most important. It removes control, not entirely, but in the way it is usually understood. Most people try to control systems directly. They try to determine outcomes, to force direction, to maintain influence through constant action. But systems are too complex for direct control. They adapt, they respond, they evolve. So instead of controlling the system, the operator shapes the conditions within it. They influence pathways, they adjust flow, they position themselves where movement is already forming. This creates a different kind of control, indirect, distributed, stable, because it does not rely on constant intervention. It relies on structure, and structure sustains itself. This is the full inversion. Force becomes unnecessary. Confrontation becomes inefficient. Visibility becomes conditional. Control becomes structural. And once this inversion is understood, power no longer looks like effort. It looks like alignment. Movement without friction. Change without resistance. Direction without force. This is not easier. It requires more awareness, more patience, more precision, because nothing is immediate. Everything depends on timing, on structure, on conditions that are not always visible. But once these conditions are understood, action becomes selective. You stop reacting to everything. You stop pushing where nothing moves. You stop exposing what is not ready. And instead, you begin to operate within the system in a way that does not trigger opposition. This is where efficiency appears, not because effort disappears, but because effort is no longer wasted. And this is where the chapter closes, not with a technique, but with a shift in perception. Because operating without resistance is not something you apply once. It is something that changes how you see every system, every interaction, every structure you move within. And once that shift happens, you cannot fully return to the old model. Because force will always feel inefficient, and alignment will always feel inevitable. From here, the next step is not about moving inside systems. It is about understanding how systems begin to push back. Because once you operate at this level, resistance does not disappear. It evolves. And learning how to navigate that evolution is what comes next. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the following chapters and episodes.